Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Robert Baylor, Director of Communications at NUCA. Welcome to our latest construction law webinar presented by NUCA's Legal Committee. First, before we begin, some webinar housekeeping for attendees. Today's webinar will be recorded. It will be available on NUCA's YouTube channel, which can be accessed via nuca.com. All participants are muted upon entry. Phone participants can use *6 to mute and unmute themselves. Questions can be asked during the presentation. To ask a question, you can submit a written question at any time using the chat feature, and I'll read them out to Shawn. Now let's get started. Today's construction law webinar will discuss the effects of the Trump administration's tariffs on steel and aluminum on our industry. Construction material prices have jumped in recent months, and part of those increases are due to the Trump administration's potential tariffs. Contractors have significant concerns about material costs, especially those products that will be affected by a 25% steel and aluminum tariff. The new tariff schedules and threats of future trade wars may cause material price escalation to become commonplace over the next 4 years. Today's webinar will be presented by industry attorney Shawn Farrell. Shawn will discuss the tariffs and what contractors can do to minimize cost increases and how to use contracts to reduce the effects of materials price changes. Shawn Farrell is well known to NUCA members as a voice of authority on construction law. Shawn provides legal counsel to NUCA of New Jersey and is a partner with Cohen Seglias, PC in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Thank you all for joining us today for our construction webinar. Shawn, I turn the webinar over to you.
Thanks, Bob. I appreciate it. As always, I'm happy to be here and talk through these issues. I think right now in the current market of these unknown tariffs and some known, I've been fielding a lot of calls from my clients. So I know you guys might have a lot of questions on this. Feel free to send any to Bob while we're doing this seminar, and he can interrupt me and we can talk about it. So I thought I'd start off with a quote from a former CEO of Goldman Sachs, Lloyd Blankfein, who said once, "In business, I've learned that the most damaging thing you can do is face constant ambiguity and uncertainty. Markets can deal with good news and bad news, but they just can't deal with uncertainty." And I feel in some ways we're sort of in that limbo position here with tariffs going on. So I want to talk about tariffs, what they are, what impacts they can have, recent tariff implementation and their effects on the construction and utility projects, the importance of proactive legal and contractual strategies, and then provide some guidance on mitigating risks through contract structure and legal remedies. In all of that, if you have some questions that you're facing real world, you can do it anonymously, or we can talk about them as examples of what's going on. I mean, recently I had, in the end of January and the beginning of February, I had a client who was bringing in over $3.5 million worth of HVAC units from Canada, and we were trying to grapple with these very issues. And we did so, and some of those strategies that we implemented there, I'll suggest to you as potential ways that we can, mitigate the impact of any of this. So I don't have a lot of great news for anybody on, don't worry, there won't be any increases to the cost of goods and thus your overall price. But what I can tell you is we've lived through this before, right? Where it's not too far ago that we had COVID, and it's really a lot of the similar issues that we had during that, aspect of supply chain issues and how that affects your bottom line and how you go about protecting yourself. So whatever you implemented in the COVID years, let's revisit those, and let's try to do it now with these tariffs because they're very similar. So obviously we've got 25% tariffs potentially on steel, 10% on aluminum. I think recently I think maybe even on Tuesday, the United States started to impose tariffs on Canada and Mexico. So any of your products that are coming in from those avenues, that's where we see it. Now, what happens with a tariff? I've had clients call me up, and with all the, the news going back and forth, they're not even sure who pays the tariff. So when you're importing goods, it's going to come into a port. It's going to go through customs. Someone's going to come and pick up those goods. That's the importer. That person is paying the tariff. They either are going to pay it in cash, or more commonly, they're going to have a custom bond that's going to require them to pay that tax in 30 to 60 days. And then the question becomes, do they impose that additional cost on the purchaser of that product, whoever they're selling it to, and so on down the chain? And that's kind of where we stand. So I don't know, because you're all muted to me, I can't see any of you, who's really on the call, if it's prime contractors or subcontractors or material suppliers. You might want to shoot Bob sort of a quick chat to say who you are, and I can kind of focus in on maybe if we had more of one category of vendor or contractor on the line, I could focus in on that, because it really does matter where you stand in any of those settings as to what you're going to do, right? So if you want to text Bob who's on the line, and Bob, whenever you get a feeling of that, we can start kind of guiding my discussion that way.
Shawn, I have an answer for you right now. It looks like
All right.
half suppliers and the other half contractors, but we actually have a lot of suppliers on here as well too. Yep. Yeah,
Mostly
it's really
prime contractors or subcontractors?
a little mix of both.
Okay.
Both subcontractors
Okay.
and prime. So it's really three categories.
Right. So one of the things we also have to think about is not just the direct cost increase for any materials, but a lot of experts have been talking about that these tariffs are going to cause material shortages and delays, as well as increases in price, right? So we're going to have to deal with tariffs with respect to what they can do to material shortages and those delays. And that's why I said that COVID era that we just walked through will be very important. What I urge no one to do on this call is just to rely on sort of the exclusions that you might interpose into a purchase order or a contract. That's not usually sufficient to deal with these issues. I think you need to deal with them head on with what your contract says and how you're going to deal with these impacts. Obviously, from suppliers, they're going to want to say, so one thing is, what does your contract say? Do we have a contract right now that's signed, that we know what the obligations are, and we're stuck with those terms? And that would also include any of the prime contractors on here who are doing government contracting, right? Because government contracting, be it from federal or state or local municipalities, you're not negotiating those contracts. They are what they are. They're not going to change. They're not going to change anytime soon. Now, I know some of the work that I do with the local chapter of NUCA in New Jersey, I'm the general counsel of that chapter. We're trying to pass legislation on getting some laws passed where we could actually input price adjustment clauses into the contract. And I'll talk about price adjustment contracts. They're not so unheard of. Some contracts will have them. We'll talk about them in a second. So that's one thing that everyone can do. But obviously, you want to know, do I have a contract? Is it signed? Or can I negotiate the contract in face of what I see as a risk right now? Obviously, the most difficult scenarios where you have either you are primed to a government contract or you've already signed it. So let's start with that scenario, because that's the toughest scenario to talk about. And we'll kind of walk through what I would do there and what provisions you might want to look at in your contract first to see if you can get additional relief, which is obviously a change order to increase the price. You should look at this contract, by the way, with your lawyer. I'm not an advocate for full employment for lawyers, but these days it kind of seems that way. This is an important subject matter, and you really need to understand what your contract says and where you can turn to get relief, right? So if you have a signed contract, that's what I'm talking about, or you have a government contract, you got to know what your terms and conditions say. For example, for those doing federal work, the federal acquisition regulations are going to control your contract. And there I would look to the tax provisions. Yes, the tax provisions, in particular FAR 52229-3, right? So I'll read it to you. It says the federal, state, and local taxes provide for a price increase or after imposed taxes that a contractor is required to pay or bear as a result of legislative, judicial, or administrative action taking effect after the contract date. So those in the federal world know that the federal acquisition regulations are in all of your contracts, and they're incorporated in there. And that provision, that tax provision, gives us some avenue for relief because a tariff is a tax. And therefore, right there, knowing that contract provision and that tax provision, you might want to turn back to that, look at that, and see, can I ask for a change, an increase in the price related to this additional tax that I could not have known? Now, if you are on a federal job and you want to rely upon that section, prompt notice to the owner of a tax is going to be paramount to getting that passed and through. So you want to do that immediately. But guess what? Taxes and that requirement to pay your taxes and follow federal and state laws are pretty much in everyone's contracts. I mean, the contracts that I'm looking at, there's usually a provision in there that's going to say the contractor is subject to that. So if we understand what the federal law says, and we understand even if we're in a state or a municipal contract, that our contract says we're going to follow all federal state laws and pay all taxes, then does this become an opportunity in your contract to use that same paradigm, if you will, that same argument that you would under the federal acquisition regulations to say, I'm entitled to additional money? We always want to be entitled to things. We always want to be able to turn back to the contract and say, here's the provision that we negotiated that allows me to increase that price. So if you have that situation, either on a federal or a state or a municipal job, let's look immediately for provisions like that so that we can justify it. In addition, there could be some additional clauses in fixed price contracts, rather, for price adjustment clauses. You should look at that. The Federal Acquisition Regulations 16.203 cover that issue, where you can ask for additional price increases based upon certain metrics that are in your contract or not in your contract related to price increases. So that might be another avenue that you want to look at for whether or not your contract currently allows for a change in the price related to these tariffs. If none of that works out, we got to look to change orders or change clause provisions within the contract. Now, that type of remedy is going to be more difficult than the others that I've just mentioned, right? Because here, the government has the opportunity to always increase or decrease your contract scope in the terms of changes or directives. And if that leads to increases or decreases in the cost, that's typically what is covered in a change order or change clause. But that is not to say that you could not advance some sort of argument underneath that change provision that this is an unforeseen condition that you couldn't have anticipated at the time of contracting, and you're entitled to an additional price increase. Now, how would you do that? I mean, preferably, factually, you'd have the ability to say that the project got delayed in some way, not because of your cause, outside of your control, and therefore you were unable to buy the product in a certain month, and therefore it's just a byproduct of delay analysis that we're more accustomed to, right? So if I couldn't buy the product in January because of delays unrelated to me as the prime, and I had to buy it in March, well, now that might be after the tariff has gone into effect, and therefore it's an additional cost that I could not have foreseen. That's a direct result approximately cost, is how we would say it in a legal world, from that initial delay. Well, one of the things you have to think about, though, is how would you establish that, right? Just to say that to an owner might not be as compelling as if I could establish in the beginning that I actually was going to buy the products in a certain month. So is that reflected in a schedule? Is it reflected in meeting minutes? Is it in the working papers of my estimate that I can show somebody to support the change order request for additional money? So all of these things, I think, have to be considered when you already have a contract, or you're in a government contract where you're not going to be able to negotiate the terms and conditions. Now, if you're a subcontractor, obviously you can negotiate the terms and conditions even on a government project. And if you're a material supplier, the same. So that's a difference, right? Is whether or not I have a contract or not a contract. And those are the provisions I would look to if I had a contract that was signed, or I'm in a government contract that I can't negotiate. So one of the things you also have to think about, if we already have our contracts lined up and we can't change the terms, are delays, right? Because in addition to the obvious financial consequences of I just have to pay more for this product, are whether or not these experts are going to be right, and whether or not there's going to be delays and supply chain issues because of that. So then you're also going to have to know, what does my contract say with respect to excusable delays, and whether or not those excusable delays are compensable, right? One of the primary places that most people turn to is that force majeure contract provision. And I think in this current stage, I think everyone's probably familiar with that provision, because I know during COVID, I looked at it, I think, with probably every one of my clients. But look to that clause to determine whether or not this is an unforeseen event that you could not have anticipated, and therefore you're entitled to some relief. Now, the problem with force majeure clauses is that most clauses would give you time, but not money. So while they cover unforeseen events that may make performance impossible, it usually only entitles you to time, and that might not give you the relief that you need. Now, for the delay issues, if you're having supply chain issues, that time might be, in fact, the relief you need, right? I also have a fear, if you're looking for money out of a force majeure clause, that, it might be argued that these tariffs don't meet that threshold, and an owner might not agree that it's an unforeseen event. So you got to look at the clause specifically, because it's likely not to say tariff in it. So then the question becomes, by not including the word tariff, is it an exclusion of that possibility? Or does it fit more broadly into other language that might be in that force majeure clause, like government acts, right? This is certainly a government act. I mean, the government is taking control of it. So that's something you're going to have to think about and evaluate on a case-by-case basis as to what your contract says and whether or not you can ask for additional compensation related to that. On federal projects, you got to look to, again, the federal acquisition regulations concerning excusable delays and cost increases, as probably in section 52.249. You want to look there, where it says the contractor shall not be liable for any excess cost if the failure to perform the contract arises from causes beyond the control and without the fault or negligence of the contractor. So that's a pretty broad provision. You want to articulate why this tariff fits within that section. But similarly, in state and local municipality contracts, it's that same paradigm of argument that you're looking for, that this is outside of your control, you can't impact it, and therefore you're entitled to not only time, but also compensation. Okay? Finally, I think one of the things you got to think about is, and since you're all on this seminar, I think you're doing it, is think ahead as to what countries or what impacts can happen. Meaning, what am I going to do if tomorrow it's more than Mexico and it's more than I guess China and Canada, some other country where I'm getting my product from, right? I recently had this scenario with, as I started the talk here today, talking about a client who was bringing in HVAC product from Canada. The solution for us there was, because we were all in contracts, we were all locked into numbers. So was the supplier, by the way, locked into a number, is that it was worth everyone's concerted contribution to expedite the delivery of these HVAC units and the storage costs that would be incurred to do that. It was going to be less of a burden. I think at the time that we were talking about this, I think the current administration was talking about a 50% tax on goods coming in from Canada. And therefore, the creative response to it was, well, let's expedite the cost and mitigate the loss. And that should always be looked at as a possibility if we believe that the tariffs are going to be fluctuating or changing, or we're not really sure what the tariffs are going to be right now. Obviously, if the tariffs go in and they're set and they're in force, then the thing you want to do, I mean, the easiest thing to do is price it into your price. Consider it, right? If you don't have the contract executed already. So this is kind of advice going forward from today, as opposed to turning back to I already have the contract. So we want to negotiate within the contract itself the relief that we want. We want to mention tariffs as a possibility under force majeure contracts. If we are negotiating our contracts with subcontractors or directly with suppliers, you want to lock them into a price. Conversely, for the suppliers on the line here, you do not want to be locked into a price. And then the question becomes, what leverage do we have? Can we get into long-term relationships where we can, promise products that we're going to buy directly from them for some negotiation of management of risk, meaning at certain percentages or certain levels, we're going to be entitled to an escalation, but not for the whole thing. Maybe for the first 10, 15% change in price, everyone is going to bear it themselves. But after that, we're going to be willing to talk about triggering events that will allow us to pay for additional costs. So these are all things you can do going down the chain or up the chain, to be honest with you, on future contracts, not on the contracts you have, but on future contracts. You got to look at sort of that price escalation. What are going to be the triggering events? Are we going to do it any cost increase? Or are we going to put sort of, waterfall moments within the contract that certain parties are going to bear the risk? And also, in a price escalation clause, if there's certain parameters where it's a ceiling and I get to go out. If the price goes over this particular ceiling, I get out of the contract. I don't have to do the work, or I can suspend the work. These are all considerations that we need to think about when we're talking about tariffs and the potential increase in the price of goods and services. And then the final thing to think about is, going forward are new laws. And what can we do as an organization, or what can we do locally to promote, that there's going to be some incorporation of a price escalation clause mandated by law into contracts, maybe based on a commodities indices or some other form of tracking pricing that we can look to get some relief from these events. So to kind of recap, my suggestions are, we're in an unknown sort of environment because things are changing almost daily. And we hear a lot of things on the news that these tariffs are going to be imposed and they're going to be imposed at certain rates. And then the next day we hear it's a lower rate, or it's not going to happen, or I'm going to put a delay into it. It's not going to happen this month, it'll happen next month. So we've got to think about what that means for our current projects and our ongoing projects. For the current projects, we've got to look at our contracts, how they're worded, and where we best can make an argument, be it under a tax provision or be it under a excusable delay provision or under some sort of change order, change condition provision, that we can make the best argument forward to advance, additional cost up to the owner. We have to look at our contracts going down the chain as well. Are we incorporating in the same terms to them? Do we have escalation clauses or prohibitions of escalation and in our contracts going down? Are people locked in? And then negotiating new terms. Obviously, we want to address this as explicitly and unambiguously as we can as to who's going to bear the risk of potential increases in the price because of tariffs. So that takes me to about the half-hour mark. I want to leave a little time here for any questions that anybody might have. I don't know, Bob, if anybody has chimed in with anything yet, but
Shawn, we actually have a question, and it's sort of a two-part question. It's actually directed towards our attendees, but I think you should be able to answer it as well, too. And the
all right.
question from Andy Mortensen is, this question is for all suppliers. How hard would it be to provide the cost impact of the tariffs as a separate line item, allowing contractors to easily relay these costs to owners? Shawn, why don't you start off if you can answer it?
Well, that might be a harder question than it first implies, but I mean, there's some reasonableness of the cost increase because most people don't want to show you what the rock bottom direct cost is for anything that we're doing. We don't want to do that if we're the prime, we don't want to do it for the subs, and we don't want to do it for the suppliers. So to some degree, there's markup on all of these goods and services because we're not out here philanthropically to work. We're trying to make a profit. So there could be some hesitancy for that type of transparency, but you get a pretty good range, I think, just by knowing what the imposition of the tariff is, right? So if it's a 25% increase in goods and services that are coming over, that gives you an approximation without knowing the actual direct cost of a supplier. But I'll leave that open to the suppliers if how openly and transparent they are on what the direct costs are and what their markups are and how they would feel about that.
Are there any suppliers who want to either anonymously or, of course, state your name and company who want to answer the question? And if you want,
well, Andy and Shawn, this is Don Taylor. I'm with Cohen. Yeah, it's a good question, and what was asked, I think, from Andy about us being able to state the direct cost on our invoices of a tariff. So we have let's just break it down to make it as easy as could be. We have a valve that we have a price on to you that's quoted. The tariff comes into effect. The manufacturer therefore comes to us and says, hey, we're going to have to increase the cost of this particular product, and let's just say 10%. Well, that's what we as a manufacturer, let's say that our suppliers, our manufacturers say is going to be the cost differential due to the tariff. They have told us, although we haven't actually had any yet, they have told us that they would prefer to sell us at the price quoted, and then on their invoice to us have a 10% adder for tariff. Sounds pretty simple. I personally would prefer it that way. The one thing that I know, at least in our organization, that has already been discussed, if in fact this starts impacting this, was how do we pass this on to our customers? First and foremost, after a conversation, do we do it on the invoice, which I have advocated for as a clean 10% from the manufacturer, 10% passed on, and hopefully our contractors can, of course, pass that on. That's what we're looking to do. if and when these hit us. The final part of it is there's different components that make up a manufactured product that we sell you, where the manufacturers may say the tariff increase is really only going to be 2% because only a few of the components make up that is being tariffed. So the tariffs could be less than what we all hear at that level, from the news and all that. And then finally, the last thing I just want to say is there are some manufacturers that have said that with, let's just say, a 10% tariff hitting their goods coming into the country, rather than put out a 10% separate line item tariff that they're charging the suppliers that buy from them, they're just raising their price by, let's say, and what I've seen that they've proposed is a 10% increase on their price. And let's just say, make it simple, if you want to call it that, in their eyes. Now, that may not help you all, and we would want our contractors to tell us what we can do to help you all be clear enough to your customers to be able to recoup any tariff costs. So I don't think that would answer everybody's question, but at least that's where we are at Core & Main right now.
Don, thank you very much.
Let me jump in there, Don, before you go to another question, because that's a great point. I mean, if you're making a request for additional consideration to an owner or to the prime, if you're a subcontractor, having that clear invoice that shows the markup will help. For example, let's just say we were going to go under the provision for a tax increase and say that this was an unknown tax at the time we entered into the contract. It's not within our control, and therefore we're entitled to additional consideration. That backup is the same backup that you would do to any change order, right? You have to justify what that additional cost is. So Don's suggestion of putting just a clean line item onto an invoice that it's marked up 2, 3, 10%, that will be the support that you need to make the arguments that your contract allows.
Okay. But that's good to hear, and I appreciate you saying that, because I'll take that info directly from a contractor, certainly to our company, which, we've got IT, we've got our ERP system, and how do we do it, and all that. But still, I know we'll try to do what our customers need and can best get their money back as well. So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Don.
I was going to say, Don, then it's going to become more complicated for you, though, because you're going to be creating an invoice that involves multiple manufacturers that are supplying you. And if one has a 10%, another one has a 2%, and another one has a 3%, then you have to figure out how you can create a tariff line item to your customer.
Exactly. And let me just quickly kind of give an example of something that maybe a lot of our, let's just say our core business is what I'll refer to: water, sewer, underground contractors. We also sell water meters into 2 municipalities that are changing out their systems. Well, a lot of the water meter, and I'm going to say from Census, is a lot of what we sell, is produced here in the U.S. No effect. Well, a piece of those water meters are produced in Mexico. So the Census has come to us just as a, hey, listen, we don't have anything yet, but we're going to kind of wait and see, but we will impose tariffs on those components that make up the water meter that they import and or have manufactured in Mexico. Well, what we have said is from them is, okay, if that amounts to, and I'm just make it easy, $7 for a water meter. Okay, then what we want from you is, here's a water meter price that we quoted you, and here's a line item for $7 that you're going to charge us in tariffs. And why would I say we want that? So that we can say, municipality or contractor, here's the $7 additional charge from census, if you will, or from our manufacturers, so you can take it from there. So you're right about that, but that's why we would want the individual charges from our manufacturers so that we're transparent, like everybody wants to use that term, as could possibly be. So
then,
yeah.
Don, your objective would be able to create multiple line items for the contractor so that they could go, then they could see where this is affected and how it's affected and what it's affecting.
Yes, that's exactly what I would want to do. And I know our company would have the intention to do. I just know that we have an IT department that bills our customers, meaning, an ERP system. And I know there has to be some work or look at, can our ERP system do this correctly too? So I just know that's the only thing that I've heard internally right now.
And I think that would be the best to have the arguments and positions that Shawn's discussed.
Yep.
Yeah. I would also want to show the differential between what the original price was and now what the invoice is going to be, right? So a quote that you provided and why the increase is going up. And for people on the line who might not have, a supplier as sophisticated as Don, if you're buying from local or smaller people, even a letter explaining from a supply house why that increase is happening is better justification than you just saying, you can look in the newspaper and there's a 25% tariff. I need 25% more. So to differentiate, here's my quote, save that quote, don't get rid of it, hold on to that email, however you get it. And then the eventual invoice with some explanation between it, if it's a smaller contractor who can't really, do the more electronic, sophisticated path that Don suggested.
We have another question from Shane. Is there a possibility that we could use a force majeure clause to request additional time or project suspension until tariffs are lifted in order to avoid changes in prices of significant value?
I think that's a great question. It would be unlikely that would be granted in that way because it's too ambiguous, right? You would be suspending the project for an indefinite period of time because you can never really know when the tariff is or is not going to be imposed because they're being imposed by, executive order. So unless the owner was in line with this idea on a public works project, I doubt it because obviously whatever we're doing for replacing a sewer line or a wastewater treatment plant or whatever we're doing, there's going to be some public need for that, construction. And therefore, I don't think that they would wait on it. If it was more of a commercial building and it was significant enough and the funding allowed it. So a lot of times when you're going out and you're the owner of the project, you've got a construction loan for a period of time, maybe a year, maybe 2 years, but at some point that construction loan comes up and you want to move to permanent financing. All of those things can be impacted if you gave a very long or a very open-ended extension of time. So very creative. I like it. It really is going to be an owner-driven answer, and I can't think of too many situations where the owner would want to give it to you in that extended of a period, just to wait until it gets lifted so that something can continue at the same price. And by the way, I hate to say this, but thinking it through, what if it was a year and then wages have gone up a little bit, as one would expect year over year? That could also eat into, your profit center there too. So a lot of unknowns there that might not be the answer to your question, even if you can get the owner to agree.
We've got a third question from Jake. What are the thoughts on domestic commodities that are impacted by tariffs indirectly, so there is no way to tie it to definitive value?
Okay, that Jake might be a lawyer because that's an unfair question. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very difficult scenario where unless the domestic commodity supplier can give you some narrative or some explanation as to kind of what Don was saying with the water meters, that a component of it is coming from Mexico and it has a price increase on it. So while I am 100% U.S. owned company and I'm giving this to you, I am impacted by these supply chain issues and tariffs that are on these countries. So without that additional information, I think it would be unlikely for an owner to accept. So if I answer the question directly and you can't tie it to a tariff, then I think it's unlikely you'll get a price increase. If it's significant enough where you can impose upon your suppliers to provide you with a more nuanced answer and justification, I think you're in a better position.
Thank you, Shawn. Are there any other questions? Hearing none.
Yeah, this is Shane. I have one more question about the public works environment. So, you know, a lot of the suggestions being made in the discussions, I would say, kind of fall more into private work. Maybe you have the ability to negotiate terms, et cetera. But the reality that I see in a public works setting is we, as a contractor or a bidder, we can't change the terms and conditions of the contract. I think that, Shawn, you were saying that, hey, the force majeure clause to request additional time or to suspend the job, probably not going to be an option for you. So I guess a separate question then, for jobs that we're bidding today, do you have in a public works environment, which most of the time during the bidding process, the owner is required to publish any questions by other contractors. Do you have any suggested language or questions that we should be asking pre-bid to public agencies regarding tariffs to raise the awareness to the other bidders or to force the owner to address the topic of tariffs directly?
That's a great question. So let me first address, when you said that a lot of what I was saying relates to kind of the public world, it doesn't. I want everyone to know, when I talked about the federal acquisition regulations, that's I'm sorry, when you said I was talking about the private world, federal acquisition regulations are public, right? So that's the federal government. It can also be on private work where you're going for federal monies. So there are grant monies that are provided when, you know, the federal government wants to promote certain things within even a local, town, through like RACP money and things like that. The federal acquisition regulations might get imposed into your contract. So it's something to think about. And then the other provisions that I was talking about related to tax and related to change order provisions are both in the public and private sector. So in a public sector, yes, you're right. Everything has to be done with open disclosure during that bidding time period. And if you ask for an addendum, meaning a clarification on the bid documents, they would have to publish it to all of the bidders that picked up a bid package. Is there a specific language that you can ask? I mean, you got to be careful what you ask for. If you ask for whether or not tariffs will be used as a justification for an increase in price, the answer might be no. And if the answer is no, then the solutions that I was giving to you with respect to the federal acquisition regulations or with, contract provisions that deal with tax or with contract provisions that deal with unforeseen conditions and change orders, you're in a much worse position there, right? So the answer just might be no. Also, it's a low bid environment. So even if they say yes or no, you're still going to have to jump that shark tank and take the risk of whether or not you're going to factor in to your price the potential for additional tariffs down the road. I don't know what that is. I don't know what that looks like for you. It might be worthwhile, again, to be creative and think, well, if I really have, opportunity for this project, do I have the resources to purchase goods and store them now Is that too much? There's a whole host of issues there, Shane, that I can't answer it directly. I would think asking the public body to clarify whether or not a tariff is a reason for an increase in price, I think you're likely to get a no answer. So I probably wouldn't ask it.
Are there any other questions? I think that's it. Let's go and wrap this up. Shawn, thank you very much for your time today to lead this important discussion. We would also like to thank our many national partners for generously supporting NUCA and our monthly webinar series. Today's webinar has been recorded. A recording of this webinar will be made available on NUCA's YouTube channel over the next few days. And thank you for your time today to join us for this very special NUCA webinar and for supporting NUCA. Thank you for your time this afternoon, and please enjoy the rest of your week.